Hello, and welcome to today's top tips to submit a capital grant application presentation. First, let's talk a bit about OTF's investment strategy, where we are investing for impact. With the help of leaders in the public benefit sector and relying on the expertise of our staff and volunteers, OTF has identified the most important changes that should happen in Ontario over the next decade for communities to be more healthy and vibrant. Each element of our strategy builds on the next so that we can measure the impact of each investment. We are confident that over time, the cumulative impact of all the investments we make will be reflected in positive changes to the Canadian Index of Well-Being and will improve the quality of life for people here in Ontario. To lead change that matters in communities, we have identified 6 action areas, and for each area, a set of priority outcomes that are backed by leading research and practice in the nonprofit sector. Every grant we make is an investment in only those activities that will achieve one of these priorities. Every grant recipient makes a commitment to achieve specific results with the support of our knowledgeable and experienced staff. So how does OTF's strategy fit with the Canadian Index of Well-Being? OTF's investment model focuses on 6 action areas. The action areas were chosen based on alignment with the 12 Canadian Index of Well-Being indicators. The 12 Canadian Index of Well-Being indicators act as our North Stars and help OTF achieve our vision. Priority outcomes are what we aim to achieve as a result of our investments and are defined by 2 or 3 grant results. We will then be able to report on our progress towards achieving the priority outcomes in the medium term by rolling up the grant level results from across the province. Grant results are components that, combined together, achieve the priority outcome and that can be measured through the use of specific indicators. Each grant recipient will report on specific indicators, the metrics, associated with the grant results so OTF can gather and review the grant level results across the foundation in the short term. So now let's take a look at the 6 action areas, starting off with active people. For the first grant result, our investment priorities are improved infrastructure for both unstructured and structured activity. Unstructured activities are less organized, generally self-directed, often with limited or no rules. For example, jogging, riding a bike with friends or family, playing in the park, or hiking a trail. Structured activities would be more formal, often with rules and specific objectives. In other words, sports training and competition and organized exercise programs. Types of projects that would be included here would be field or facility repair and upgrades, or the repair or replacement of equipment. Of course, only equipment that is necessary to participate. An example would be a community center that is being updated to meet public health and safety requirements to increase access to the facility for physical activity programs. The second grant result, our investment priorities are more infrastructure. In other words, new skate parks, trails, bike paths, playgrounds, and playing fields, etc., as well as increased accessibility. For example, lights on a soccer field that allow additional programming hours, or retrofitting a rink to allow for persons with disabilities to play sledge hockey. An example for this grant result would be a project led by local youth to design and build a new skate park that will provide a clean, positive environment for youth and a safe place to ride away from traffic and pedestrians. Moving on now to connected people. The 2 grant results in this action area that support capital exclusive projects relate to increasing social connections and bringing diverse groups together to improve community life. We support the places and spaces for activities that build social connections and increase community collaboration. These include, but are not limited to, recreational activities, cultural activities, and other social interactions. Their fit with these grant results depends on how clearly the applicant demonstrates that the reason for the capital enhancements is to make the space or place available and appropriate for said activities. Naturally, this includes the accessibility improvements, renovations that make a space more inclusive. In other words, universal washrooms, change rooms, AV equipment, flexible seating, etc. The risk is that any and every renovation may be seen to fit, so I would ask a few questions each time. Number 1, identify the population that is socially isolated or the diverse groups involved. 2, identify how their social isolation is being caused or maintained by lack of access to this space. 3, identify how their social connections will be increased by activities that are held or will be held in this space. 4, clarify how the space or equipment is being used collaboratively to improve community life. And finally, 5, will the capital project make the space more A, universally accessible, or B, accessible for this population? Moving on now to green people. In this action area, we support capital projects that enable better planned and more sustainable ecosystem conservation and restoration. Emphasis under this grant result tends to be more on the sustainable side than the planning side. In other words, capital investments that help ensure natural values are restored, conserved, and sustained. The key is that there needs to be some reasonable and logical connection between the capital project and its relation to benefit the habitat, ecosystem conservation, and or restoration. If it's completely unrelated to ecosystem conservation, or so indirectly related that it's not logical, in other words, they want to replace the septic system in their building and relate it to aquatic ecosystem conservation, then it doesn't fit. An example for this grant result would be a capital investment in habitat restoration, such as water control structure and related items necessary to restore a wetland. Next is inspired people. The goal of this action area is to move Ontarians from passive audiences to active participants in the creative process. Facilities play a large role in hosting the exchange between artistic producers and audience. Spaces that are welcoming, accessible, technically sound, and aesthetically pleasing improve the quality of production or program, while also engaging participants physically, intellectually, and emotionally. They create the conditions for the work to be well received and eliminate barriers to full and active participation. An example of this grant result for capital would be the purchase of an accessible mobile event stage that enables performing arts groups to reach new audiences by delivering performances in unconventional spaces, for example, the outdoors. Looking at promising young people, there are 2 grant results for capital grants. The first, more children and youth have emotional and social strengths, and the second, more youth are meaningfully engaged in the community. There needs to be a clear link between the capital request for a particular activity or initiative and the grant result. For the first grant result, more children and youth have emotional and social strengths. Here is an example. To help children aged 6 to 12 years with mental health challenges to improve social skills, self-esteem, and nutritional habits by engaging in gardening activities. Horticulture therapy improves the well-being of children who face behavioral, emotional, and social difficulties. Through building, planting, and harvesting a garden in a cooperative venture, children with serious mental health issues will increase their resiliency and coping abilities. Why is this aligned? They connected the capital request to the activity, then to the achievement of the grant result. They made a clear link between horticultural therapy, the need for the gardens and gardening equipment, and increased social emotional strengths of children and youth facing barriers. The second grant result, more youth are meaningfully engaged in the community. The types of initiatives that would fit here are capital requests that link the program or activity to the grant result, or the program or activity's purpose to the grant result. The last action area is prosperous people. And the grant result here is focused on basic needs, which means that any capital request needs to align with the meaning of this result. Capital projects in this action area need to be for projects that are meeting a basic need. In other words, food, shelter, clothing, essential personal items, water and sanitation, and health and wellness. An example for this grant result would be the renovation of a local drop-in center to accommodate a range of immediate support services such as addictions, housing, etc. We know that applicants often struggle between basic needs and access to service grant results, but as long as the intent of the capital project is focused on meeting basic needs, it is acceptable in this case. So now we're going to do a little activity to put this knowledge into use. Which grant result best fits the project? The project description here is the upgrade of an East End Community Studios performance capacity for broader community access. Is the answer A, arts, culture, and heritage have appropriate spaces? Is it B, conservation and restoration efforts are better planned and more sustainable? Or is it C, infrastructure is accessible and available for physical activity? Congratulations to everyone who chose A, arts, culture, and heritage have appropriate spaces. That's the correct response since the project aims to improve a community studio's performance capacity for broader community access. So now let's talk a little bit about the capital stream itself. For the capital grant stream, the amount range is between $5,000 and $150,000, and the duration of your request is up to 1 year. We do a holdback of 10% of the funding, which means that 10% of your grant will be held back to be paid upon satisfactory review of the final report. Types of projects funded in this stream include equipment, new construction, renovations or repairs to community spaces, outdoor installations, and the purchase of land or buildings. OTF provides capital funding for construction and renovation, which means repairs, renovations, or construction costs, as well as permanent equipment costs. Also, equipment, capital purchases that are not part of a building and are directly related to the project. Also, land or property purchase, which means the direct purchase cost of land or property. And finally, can also include developmental costs. Costs associated with construction, such as the development of plans, legal fees, or survey costs. These costs can be up to a maximum of 20% of the total grant request. All costs funded by OTF must be eligible and directly attributable to the project. OTF limits capital funding to $150,000 for any single eligible project to effectively respond to the broad need for capital funding in Ontario's voluntary sector. The types of costs and projects not funded would be contributions to annual funding drives and capital campaigns, activities completed or costs incurred prior to the approval of the request by OTF, for example, costs including the cost to get quotes, line drawings, etc., incurred prior to approval of the grant or in order to get necessary documentation to apply for the grant. Also, type costs or projects not funded would be staff salaries, benefits, and wage costs. Taxes such as GST and HST for which the recipient is eligible for a tax rebate and all other costs eligible for rebates. Also not funded, contingency costs or overhead and administration costs. Next, we want to highlight for you the top reasons why some applications don't move forward. These are important to keep in mind as we move through the presentation. We've developed our tip list to help you steer clear of what we see as the most common reasons some applications miss the mark. The most common reason for a capital decline is weak or no alignment with the grant result chosen. It's not enough to just describe the need for your project or a description of the repairs and renovations. You need to describe the impact that completing the capital project will have on people who use this space. Two other common decline reasons include no information or too little detail included in the budget notes, and a lack of explanation of how the proposed project will benefit the community. So next up, here are our top tips to avoid a capital decline. Number 1, focus on the people first, not just the capital activity. Determine who will benefit and how. Rather than simply saying you need funding to replace a leaky roof, focus instead on how and who the people that benefit from completing your project. For example, you could say, after a new roof is installed, we will offer 20 new fitness programs to approximately 300 seniors per week. Step number 2, select the grant result, priority outcome, and metric that best aligns with your project. Look for how your project lines up with one of our 9 capital-specific grant results. The metrics could include one or more of the following numbers depending on the grant result you've picked related to your OTF project. Could be the amount of new or renovated space, which would be total square feet or kilometers. Could be the number of additional hours available or the area impacted, kilometers or kilometers squared. If OTF is only funding a portion of your project, only include the target metrics for the OTF capital cost. OTF does not require a metric for equipment. Step 3, decide the scale and scope of your capital project and understand the OTF capital investment stream requirements. For example, the amount range is between $5,000 and $150,000. The duration is up to 1 year. And again, to be noted that 10% of the funding will be held back to be paid upon satisfactory review of your final report. Step 4, review OTF's policies. Read OTF's policies, specifically the eligibility and capital grants policy, to ensure that you're in compliance. Step 5, determine your budget. Determine the costs of each capital item. Eligible costs include renovations or repairs to community spaces, construction of new buildings, with proven need of course, outdoor installations, purchase of land or buildings, equipment, and developmental costs up to 20% of the total budget request. Only include the non-refundable HST amount. Staff salaries, contingency costs, and overhead and administration costs are not eligible. Don't include ineligible costs in your budget requests. Items over $10,000 require 2 written quotes. Ask for what you need, not what you think we will fund. Step 6, gather proof of ownership or lease agreement. Proof of ownership or a 5-year lease agreement is required for all renovations or improvements to land or property, including permanent equipment. Step 7, gather the people needed to do the work. Determine who will oversee your project. If you don't have the expertise in-house, find a competent volunteer outside your organization to coordinate the work. Step 8, determine the appropriate start date. OTF does not fund retroactively. Ensure that your project's start date is after the public announcement date for your grant. Consult our granting critical path for deadlines and public announcement dates for more information. Step 9, take photos. For all capital projects, you are required to provide at least one before picture of the area to be renovated. If you are replacing old or outdated equipment, take a photo of the before of your current equipment and provide a photo of the after of what you want to purchase. If you are purchasing new equipment, include a photo of what you want to purchase. And finally, step 10, have required documentation in place and available during the grant review process. In other words, have it in place by the time you submit your application. Documents that would be required would be 2 written quotes for any item over $10,000, proof of ownership or a 5-year lease agreement for all renovation or improvements to land or property, collaborative agreements, if applicable. The items listed above don't need to be submitted with the grant application. However, you are required to have these documents in place and on hand for 6 years if your grant is approved. OTF may also request them during the grant review process. Now let's take a look at the assessment of capital grants. Assessment criteria is available online on our website at otf.ca. Based on application answers, OTF reviewers enter a score in each of the 5 assessment areas. Scores range from -2, strongly disagree, -1, 0, neutral, 1, and 2, strongly agree. Each category is worth 20%. And the different categories are strategy, process, people, infrastructure/equipment, and finally, value for money. Looking at the first one, strategy. Your strategy tells the story of your capital project. You should begin by identifying the need in your community. Then, you explore an idea in response to that need. You also need to describe how pressing the need is and make the link between how your project will address it and achieve the grant result. The coherence between the need, your proposed project, and the grant result are what makes up your strategy score. Moving on to process. Make sure that you give yourself enough time to complete the project at a reasonable pace. Make sure that the project activities align with the grant result and are reflected in the budget. For example, if you will purchase and install equipment in the second month, make sure that there are equipment costs in your budget. And as a little note, be sure to add text to the notes in your budget. Moving on to the people assessment category. What skills are needed for the project to be realized? Do those skills exist in the organization at this time? If not, who will be assigned to ensure that the project is successfully completed on time and on budget? Infrastructure/equipment. Friendly reminder, you need at least 1 photo for all capital requests. Appropriate means that the need for the project is clearly explained in the application. For example, in a town that already has a community theater space, you would need to explain why it is appropriate. Does the cost seem reasonable to achieve the identified grant result? Value for money is about ensuring OTF knows the real costs of the project we evaluate, whether the costs are reasonable, based on local and historic knowledgeable. There is no formula, but you need to explain why we should invest in your project. Finally, know that there are various ways to get help. On our website, there is all sorts of information you need to know about OTF and how to apply for a grant. Our website address is www.otf.ca. You can also contact our support center. You can call or email with your questions about registering or applying for a grant. You can also book a one-on-one coaching session over the phone with one of our program managers. To set up a coaching appointment, call our support center at 263 2887.